In 2008, a loaf of bread in Zimbabwe cost $550 billion. Not because bread was rare, because money had stopped meaning anything. People didn't count their cash by the bill, they counted it by the kilogram. Wheelbarrows, not wallets, were how you carried enough money to buy groceries. And here's the part that should terrify you. This didn't happen in some ancient, chaotic past. It happened in your lifetime. To understand how a country's money could become worth less than the paper it was printed on, you have to go back to a place that used to be called something else entirely: the breadbasket of Africa. For most of the late 20th century, Zimbabwe wasn't a cautionary tale. It was a success story: rich soil, a stable currency, and a commercial farming sector so productive it fed not just its own people, but exported food across the region. The Zimbabwean dollar, at independence in 1980, was actually worth more than the US dollar. Let that sink in. But underneath that prosperity was a fracture that had never been resolved. Most of that fertile farmland was still owned by a small population of white commercial farmers, a legacy of colonial rule. And by the late 1990s, the man who had led Zimbabwe since independence, Robert Mugabe, was facing something new: political pressure, a weakening economy, a population growing impatient. So in the year 2000, his government launched a program that would change everything: fast-track land reform. Farms were seized, often violently, and redistributed. The stated goal was justice. The result was collapse, because many of the new landholders weren't trained commercial farmers. Production cratered, exports vanished almost overnight, and a country that once fed its neighbors couldn't reliably feed itself. That's the first domino, but it's not the one that broke the country. The second domino was the government's response to the first. When an economy stops producing, but a government still has bills to pay, soldiers to fund, and a war in the Congo to finance, it has a choice to make: cut spending or print money. Zimbabwe printed money. At first it looked manageable. Inflation in 2001 sat around 112%, bad but survivable. By 2003, it had climbed past 600%. By 2006, it blew past 1,000%. And that's when most economies would have hit a wall and stopped. Zimbabwe didn't stop. Because here's the trap hidden inside hyperinflation. Once prices start rising fast enough, the government's own tax revenue collapses in real terms. So to keep functioning, it prints more money, which pushes prices even higher, which shrinks real revenue even further. It's not a spiral, it's a feedback loop with no floor. By 2007, annual inflation in Zimbabwe was estimated at 66,000%. And even that number was about to look quaint. Picture this: you get paid on a Friday. By Monday, your salary has lost half its value. Not eventually. Within days. People stopped saving money the moment they received it, because saving was a losing bet. The smart move was to spend cash the second it hit your hands, on anything: food, soap, fuel, because tomorrow it would buy less. Shops started changing prices multiple times a day, sometimes multiple times within a single hour. Cashiers in supermarkets would walk the aisles updating price tags while customers were still shopping, because the numbers from that morning were already obsolete. Bank withdrawal limits meant people needed enormous stacks of bills just to buy basic groceries, which is why the wheelbarrow became an unofficial national currency accessory. Not a fashion joke, a mathematical necessity. The government responded the only way it knew how: bigger bills. In 2008, Zimbabwe issued a note worth 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars. One single piece of paper. 100 trillion. And it still wasn't enough to buy a bus ticket in some parts of the capital by the time it hit circulation. So how bad did it actually get at the peak? Zimbabwe's government stopped reporting official inflation figures in 2008 because the numbers had become almost impossible to calculate through normal statistical methods. Independent economist Steve Hanke, who specializes in tracking currency collapses, estimated the peak monthly inflation rate in November 2008 at 79.6 billion%. Monthly. Translated into an annual rate, that number becomes almost meaningless to the human brain: 89.7 sextillion%. At that pace, prices were doubling roughly every 24 hours. Go to sleep, wake up. Everything costs twice as much as it did yesterday. This is the point where an economy stops being an economy and becomes something closer to a natural disaster. Pensions evaporated. Life savings worthless. A generation of Zimbabweans who had spent decades building financial security watched it disappear in months. Not because they made bad decisions, because the thing they trusted, their national currency, had been quietly hollowed out from the inside. By early 2009, the Zimbabwean dollar was, for all practical purposes, dead. The government made an extraordinary admission. It abandoned its own currency, officially allowing foreign currencies, the US dollar, the South African rand, to be used for everyday transactions. Almost overnight, the hyperinflation stopped, not because the economy was fixed, but because Zimbabweans had simply switched to money that other countries hadn't destroyed. It's one of the strangest endings in modern economic history. A nation effectively gave up on printing its own currency because its citizens no longer believed in it, and neither really did the government. The human cost, though, didn't reverse so easily. Millions of Zimbabweans emigrated during and after the crisis, many crossing into South Africa in search of stable wages. The economy, by some estimates, shrank by roughly half over the crisis years. And an entire generation grew up associating their own national currency with something to escape, not something to trust. Here's where this story should feel uncomfortably current. Zimbabwe didn't learn to walk away from this cliff. It went back. In 2019, the government reintroduced a national currency. Inflation returned within months. By 2020, it was back in double and triple digits. In 2024, Zimbabwe tried again, launching a new currency called the ZiG, this time claiming it would be backed by gold and foreign reserves, an attempt to rebuild the one thing every currency ultimately runs on: trust. Whether it holds is still being written, and that's really what this story has always been about. Not wheelbarrows or trillion-dollar notes or numbers too large to comprehend. Money isn't valuable because of what it's printed on. It's valuable because enough people agree to believe in it. Zimbabwe didn't just lose an economy in the 2000s. It lost something harder to rebuild than farmland or factories. It lost the one thing every currency, every bank, every government ultimately depends on to function at all: belief. And once that's gone, you can print as many zeros as you want. It still won't buy you a loaf of bread.